Hey, Fit Over 50 folks. Today I'd like to talk about one of the very useful strategies in creating a calorie flow across the course of the day that is supportive of maintaining muscle tissue while creating a modest to moderate calorie daily average calorie deficit. That's a little tricky, especially the leaner we get and the stronger we get to maintain that muscle tissue and still get a little bit leaner for whatever our purpose might be. It might be athletic performance, it might be aesthetics, whatever. But I'll talk about composition, so the makeup of your intake, in another video. But today I want to talk about just assuming your composition is pretty much on point or close to where you want it, a way to flip what is much more common in my experience with clients, flip that tendency to backload the calories and accumulate more calories as the day wears on, and create more of a front-loaded tapering caloric intake over the course of the day. Now, this doesn't work well if you work out late in the day, late afternoon, or in the early evening, because then the importance of providing adequate calories, carbohydrates, protein, and micronutrients in the post-workout meal during the immediate recovery phase it takes precedence over trying to create that calorie deficit. You can probably still do it, but it's a very delicate operation, and you have very narrow margins with that. So let's say that you work out by noon or before then, or at least by 2 or so. And you have a pretty predictable time that you wake up and go to bed. What I recommend is something that is sort of the numeric equivalent or quantitative equivalent of the adage, breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. And while that analogy is helpful to some people, a lot of people need a little bit more of a quantitative approach to that to sort of monitor how they do over the course of the day, or at least to have goals for consumption. So what I recommend is to divide your waking day into roughly 3 equal portions. So let's say you wake up at 7 o'clock. Let's say you wake up at 6. Okay, I'm going to use military time. If you wake up at 6, 5 hours from that, that's 11 o'clock. All right, 5 hours from that is 4 p.m. So, if your objective is to create a front-loaded, reasonably tapering, quantitative flow of your food over the course of the day, I recommend trying to consume up to 50% in that first third of the day. Now, this may sound like a lot, but let's say you start off with a pretty nourishing and satisfying meal sometime between 6 and 8:30. That just means trying to get in some more calories by 11, 11:15, even 11:30. And then from 11 to 4 p.m., 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., shoot for around 30% of your intake. And then finally, of course, 20% in the last chunk of that day. Now, it's a soft range. They're soft reference points, but it's very helpful to have an idea of how much you should be able to consume in the first third of the day. If you cannot consume 50% in the first third of your day, it's likely that you're already consuming more than 20% in the evening. So I would recommend, if you want to start this tomorrow, and you tend to have a flat caloric intake over the course of the day, or a backloaded caloric intake over the course of the day, that you just pick a day that you're going to do this, and you only eat as much as you absolutely need not to feel significantly hungry at bedtime. That will make it easier for you to consume a little bit more earlier. Also remember that protein is the most satiating nutrient. So if you're trying to match the amount of protein to this caloric sequence, it might be harder to get more food in the morning. So if you're creating a flat, let's say 1/3, this is protein, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you're doing that, you will have to keep in mind that the relative percentage of protein for that last bit of food that you have in the day probably needs to be in the 70+ range. So maybe a hard-boiled egg and a little tuna and tangerine and a handful of cherry tomatoes. So hopefully this is helpful. Have a great day.